This is question time about civil service values and ethics. So leave now if you thought you were in some other session. Hope you won't. For the next hour, we're going to explore the opportunities, the issues and dilemmas you face as civil servants in living up to our core values: integrity, objectivity, impartiality, and honesty. And we're going to explore those issues with a distinguished panel. If you don't know me, I'm David Normington. I'm your chairman today. I'm going to do my David Dimbleby bit if I can. I was a civil servant for 37 years. I retired at Christmas. I'm now the first Civil Service Commissioner. And if you don't know what Civil Service Commission does, well, it does two basic things. It tries to ensure that external recruitment to the civil service is on merit after fair and open competition. And it also seeks to promote and uphold the values of the civil service and to hear complaints if people think, civil servants think the civil service code has been breached. Hence the subject of today, which is about the values that underpin the civil service and how we work. Let me get on with it and introduce the panel, if I may. Our first panel member is Neil McIntosh. Neil is one of my fellow civil service commissioners, and he's one of Scotland's most distinguished public servants. For many years he worked in local government in Scotland, latterly as Chief Executive of Strathclyde Regional Council. He has a whole list of public appointments to his credit. He was a member of the UK Electoral Commission, convener of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Services. He was the inaugural chairman of the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland. Last year he even conducted an independent examination of the expenses system in the Scottish Parliament. So we know Neil is never one to shirk a challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, could you welcome Neil McIntosh? Our next guest needs little introduction, I think. She's Shami Chakrabarti, and she's been Director of Liberty for 8 years, I think, nearly 8 years. Less known, she was a civil servant. She worked in the Home Office. She trained as a barrister and worked as a lawyer in the Home Office, where she was on course for a distinguished civil service career until she left to work for Liberty. She's probably the best known defender of the importance of a framework of human rights as an essential underpinning of a democratic society. She'd left the Home Office before I got there. We were often on opposite sides of the argument, and while the Home Office and she rarely agreed, my colleagues never stopped listening to her because she's one of the country's most powerful and publicly effective advocates for human rights. She's very well known to us. Could you welcome Shami Chakrabarti? Our next panel member is Chris Stevens. Now, Chris was a civil service commissioner before I came to the commission. He has a private sector background in human resources. He was Group HR Director for DHL, and he currently chairs the DHL Foundation, which is a charity committed to community development and education in the UK and abroad. So he has a perspective that spans the private, the public, and the voluntary sectors. Chris, since February, has served as the chairman of the Judicial Appointments Commission that selects judges, not for Scotland, which is what Neil did, but for England and Wales. And it's been said that Chris is in charge, therefore, of a very high-class Job Centre Plus. Will you please welcome Chris Stevens? And last but certainly not least is the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, Gus O'Donnell. I don't know whether you know this, but Gus's first ambition, it says here anyway, was to be a professional footballer. Sadly, that was not to be, so he became an economist. And it's said that his ideal day, even now, is when a win for Manchester United coincides with an economic crisis. There have been quite a few of those days in recent years. Gus has been head of the civil service since 2005. He's so far served 3 prime ministers. He continues to lead the civil service through the toughest of times. He's memorably adopted the 4 Ps as the qualities he most wants to see in the civil service: pride, passion, pace, and professionalism. I used to know them by heart, but I'm 6 months from being a civil servant, so I have to just consult my script. qualities we've not only come to associate with the civil service, but also with Gus himself. Please could you give a warm welcome to Gus O'Donnell. Now, all the questions that we have today are based on questions which we consulted you about beforehand and you wanted to cover. I know what those questions are, but the panel doesn't. I hope there'll be lots of audience participation and intervention, and I'll try to provide opportunities for you to put supplementaries, and microphones will come your way if you want to say something. We won't be able to cover everything you want to raise, but I will have a good go at covering lots of the issues. And because some of the issues came up several times, I'm going to sometimes pose those questions as composite questions and let you come back with supplementaries. So the first question raised by a number of you, including Simon Collis of HMRC, it's about private sector involvement in the running of public services. And the question is, panel, can those with a private interest be independent and impartial in the running of public services? And put it another way, as more public services are delivered by the private sector or by ventures which have private sector involvement, won't there be a long-term erosion of civil service values? So it goes right to the heart of a current issue. And I thought, actually, I'd go to Shami first to give us an external view of that.
Can those with a private interest be independent and impartial in the running of a public service? In short, no, they can't. Sometimes on TV you get claps for giving a brief answer like that, but this is the civil service, so we give you a clap. So perhaps no, please no. I mean, it is a contradiction in terms to say that somebody with a private interest will also be independent and impartial. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't take an ideological position on whether the private sector can ever supplement public services, but I think you have to be incredibly thoughtful about which services lend themselves to that kind of involvement and which services would be inevitably compromised. Now, there are obvious services that would be inevitably compromised, I think. Policing, the judiciary are pretty obvious ones if they were farmed out to contractors and run for profit. But there are, you know, and this is the big public debate about what is and is not appropriate for privatisation. At the very least, there has to be very, very strict regulation in areas that the public think of as public services, services that are offered, you know, not on the basis purely of people's ability to, you know, to meet the cost of those services individually, but services that we've come to believe in this society are more fundamental than that. And that's not just the things that I've described, like the rule of law, policing and the judiciary and so on, but for a lot of people in Britain, aspects of healthcare have come to mean something very fundamental in which we share collectively as a society. So as I say, I don't take a strict ideological position on most things, actually, and yes, you know, private sector operatives can be professional and so on, but in terms of being truly independent and impartial, that is something that is, you know, particularly suited to public servants. And just a final point, you know, we meet on a day where, you know, to discuss civil service values of impartiality and integrity and honesty and so on. I almost wish that I were on a panel at a journalists' conference today. Because it seems to me that in recent years in this country we've seen a crisis of public trust in the banking system. We've seen a crisis of public trust in even the political system, and now it seems that people are going to face in time a crisis of trust in their, you know, in their journalists and the newspapers that they came to trust on their kitchen tables every morning. And I think that this is a time for Gus's P's in terms of the civil service to come to the fore, because you can all take pride in the fact that there has, as yet, touch wood, been no such crisis of confidence in the integrity of the civil service, and it's a time to be rather loud and proud about that.
Okay. There you are. I don't know, Chris, lots of public services, of course, are run by the private sector, and what do you want to contribute?
Well, I was involved 25 years ago in the very early outsourcing contracts for cleaning and catering and facilities management in schools and government offices, and the early TUPE contracts when people were transferred from the civil service into the private sector. And I saw I have some of the bruises from that experience, some of the good things that happened and some of the bad things that happened. I have absolutely no doubt that there is a whole range of services which are entirely legitimately run by the private sector. The very last contract I was involved in was the transfer of the NHS supplies, which is a huge and valuable contract, a hugely important contract, providing supplies to the whole of the NHS, which is actually now managed by DHL, if I can declare an interest in that. And I think it's brilliantly managed by DHL, and they've saved an enormous amount of money for the public sector, and they've provided more and better services and are meeting and exceeding the expectation of the National Health Service. So I don't have any problem in believing that there is a certain type of service that is completely legitimately run by the private sector, and the fact that people in the private sector are there to make a profit, to make a return for the investment they make, does not jeopardize the underlying ethics or the underlying moral values with which they bring to bear on the work they're doing. So I have no problem with a whole raft of services. Shami, of course, has referred to a number which are much more contentious, policing and the judiciary, and I would leave those on one side. But I'd say that there is a whole raft of completely reasonable activities which can be well and even better run, dare I say it, by the private sector than the public sector.
Gus, do you want to adjudicate on this? Is there a way of trying to bind in the private sector to the civil service values? I mean, yes. Could we insist contractually that they abided by them?
Yes, I think we can. I think there are ways to do it. I think my general principle in all of this is that we should have our ultimate goal of what's best for the public who are receiving the services and what's best for the taxpayer. And then that takes you down certain routes. And it is worth remembering, I joined the civil service, dare I say it, back in 1979, and at that time it was deemed essential that the government ran British Airways, that the government ran British Telecom, that the government ran cable and wireless, for goodness sake. I mean, when we look back on it, we think these were ridiculous things. If you look at water, when I go up to Scotland, it's absolutely essential in Scotland that water is definitely not privatised. And in England, my water is provided by a private sector company. So these things are different. I think the important thing for us is we should just look at what is best for the public. And civil service values are a really good start for anybody, even for a private sector company coming into the area. I think they should. My bins are collected by the private sector, but I'd like them to operate with honesty, objectivity, and integrity, and not to go through them to find out, what I've been throwing out, which, curiously enough, is something that journalists have allegedly done, coming back to Shami's point. So I do think it's important. We can write contracts for this. We do need to be careful in doing all of this. I think the principle is what's best for the public. It is quite interesting. People talk about health. Well, actually, even in health, it's interesting that when I go to the NHS for everything, and yet when it comes to my eyes, it's the private sector that gives me my eye tests and sells me my glasses. Is there a difference between my eyes and the rest of my body? I'm slightly puzzled. And finally, just to be sure that, as ever in these things, I end up being controversial, Shami mentioned our trust in journalists. One of the things we know is trust in journalists is very, very low already. But unfortunately, you all buy newspapers, and you seem to trust what you read in them, which I think is a bit of a mistake. So I think there is an issue there, and with current events, that's absolutely clear. But also there are allegations about the police. And the police are actually a group where we have very high trust levels, if you look at the points. So there are some issues here for all of us, and it is quite interesting for us to think, like I say, the principle I would always come back to is what's best for the public and the taxpayer. And if it needs to be absolutely 100% trusted, then I would always want to go to civil servants delivering it because of our values.
I'll bring Neil in a minute, but Simon Collis was on this subject. Is he in the audience? He's probably too busy. Oh, you're there, Simon. Would you like to, do you want to come back on this, or is there anything, comment you want to make on what you've heard? There's a microphone if you want to. You don't have to. Would you like to? In a minute? Okay. Does anybody else want to come in on this subject? Don't be shy. If you're at the back, you'll have to shout because it's quite hard to see. Anybody want to come in on this subject? Well, I'm going to, yes, there's somebody who wants to come in here. Let's get a microphone to the second row here. Are you really a member of the audience, or are you Civil Service World?
I am Civil Service World,
but still.
Indeed. I'm Matt Ross of Civil Service World. I'm also a journalist, of course.
Yes.
So I'd just briefly say, firstly, that this event which we're at, I mean, you could see it as part of, as a public service. It's something we're doing for the civil service, and I hope that in doing it, we are maintaining both the principles of the civil service and Gus's principles, and also, for Civil Service World, say that, you know, the journalism is a very broad field. I often have my own troubles in terms of making sure that we can report what the civil service is doing and make sure there's a sensible discussion without other bits of the media taking it, twisting it, and clamping down the discussion, really, making it impossible to have a discussion. But some parts of the media are trying to do a useful job, and it's important to keep talking to them at least.
We'll let that comment stand, and thank you very much for supporting this event. Anything, Simon? Are you? Yeah, Simon, right on the front row, on the far left there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, everyone. Just regarding that as well, then does the panel believe then in future that the government is right at the moment with its agenda of pushing mutualisations and everything like that as well? With, you said with the values and everything being eroded earlier, possibly. Is it right, or should we go further, does the panel think, pushing more mutualisation? Have we got it right? Is the government basically on track at the moment, or should we decrease? Or should we push ahead even more and faster?
The question is about mutuals, and which are a sort of a way of getting civil servants to take responsibility for things, to run their own enterprises, and whether that is the right policy, whether it should go further. Can I bring in Neil first?
Yes, well, thank you, David.
I'll come back to you, Shani.
Yes. First of all, certainly my own view is that there is a place for the private sector in the delivery of public services. There's a place for the voluntary and third sector in the delivery. Private sector is motivated towards profit, and therefore it would be essential to build in ethics as part of the agreement, the understanding, the contract, the way in which services were provided. I started off life in the private sector and went into the public sector because I wanted to use such abilities as I had, not to make profit for others, but hopefully to do some good in the world. And I think there is an underlying public sector ethic which is vital and essential in actually addressing the needs of the citizens. The private sector can work within that. There's no reason why it shouldn't. But I see the two as quite distinct. If we look ahead, Gus mentioned water in Scotland, and again, there are fundamental issues here in terms of Scottish perspective. Water is a fundamental human right to everyone within the community. It should not be the product of creating profit. It should be a service to the public and should be dealt with in an effective way. The last point I want to make is that actually bear in mind that you could ask the question, is it possible for public servants, for civil servants, to act in an independent and impartial way? It's not just a challenge to the private sector. And one of the challenges as we look ahead is how the civil service maintains and ensures that these principles underpin all that we do for the future. Thank you.
wanted to come back on the point about mutuals, I
think when the mist sort of descends in debates like this, it's always good to go back to the original question. And Simon Collis's original question was not about private good, public bad, or vice versa. He said, can you maintain independence and impartiality if you have a private interest? And this is the point. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary, of course, that sometimes the public is better served by the private sector. I don't want to go to a government department to buy my washing powder or all sorts of things that are really quite essential to living, because that provision does not require independence or impartiality. I'm a lawyer as well as a civil servant by training, and of course our model for providing legal services to date has been essentially a private sector model. It doesn't matter if your brief is independent and impartial. You want your brief to be partial, to be arguing for your interests in, but if you're going before a judge, you want them to be independent and impartial. I think there are certain public services that are either a natural monopoly or that involve an element of quite serious power, sometimes coercive power, that lend themselves to public servants who are truly independent and are not interested in profit. And there's a public debate about where the line should be drawn. I don't approve of private prisons. I don't approve of private agents bundling people onto aeroplanes. I think that should be a public servant. Some people clearly disagree with me. I think what's dangerous is if a government of any persuasion chooses to pursue this with an ideological agenda rather than looking at services on a case-by-case basis to look at what really is in the public interest and which model lends itself to serving the public best.
Okay, I'm going to move us on because we've got lots of other issues. I'm going to the whole set of questions about speaking up and speaking out. The best of the questions was one which was about an article this week in The Independent. The Independent had done a survey and it had been picked up by the Health Select Committee. This was about staff in the NHS who had blown the whistle and who were then penalised allegedly and persecuted as a result of blowing that whistle. The question is the panel confident that this wouldn't happen in the civil service and that people are able to speak up without fear or favour? And if they are not confident, what should be done about it? Neil, do you want to go first?
Well, yes, I wouldn't like to say I'm totally confident. It's obviously the case that actually to raise any issue of concern is a challenge to the individual. It can affect your relationships with management, it can affect your own position, and therefore it's critically important that there is a basis within the civil service which means that these matters can be raised in a proper way. As you all know, first step is to raise matters internally, but obviously there are cases where that is almost impossible or very difficult, and therefore the Civil Service Commission is there in terms of its appeals process to permit individuals to raise matters out of management and to raise matters with us. We take them very seriously. We will consider whether they are internal or external issues, and we will take them very seriously and pursue them if we feel it's necessary to do so. The objective is always to resolve these issues and to look for practice which is acceptable and take it on from there. Perhaps one point I can make is that I know from my own life experience in that respect that it's very difficult to find middle ground in this. When there is an issue of principle, when there is an issue that's fundamental, actually just simply to do nothing is not really an option that can sustain itself over the long term. People must be prepared, hopefully, to raise issues of principle and to pursue them. You have to live with yourself, you have to maintain your own values, and you have to take them through. And it's right, therefore, that within the civil service there should be avenues which mean that whistleblowing is not essential, because there is an avenue which is a confidential one where you can take issues and actually pursue them and have them pursued for you, as we are doing actively within the Commission as we speak.
But Gus, another colleague said, when departments are cutting back on jobs, is it really realistic to expect civil servants to speak up when things aren't right? Isn't it better to keep your head down?
No. Absolutely not. And that goes back to the first question about why do you want the civil service to be operating in certain areas? And with that, I strongly agree with what Shami said at the end there. It's when you want independence, impartiality, when you want those values to come through. And one of those values is honesty and objectivity and integrity. You know, all of those things mean that if there's something going wrong, you need to get out there and be clear and shout about it. You know, I think professions, as we're now seeing, that where there's a culture and things are allowed to happen, where there's an ethical base, which is, to use the technical term, dodgy, you get into a world where these things become accepted. And it seems, you know, they're common practice. Well, you know, the excuse you get is, well, everybody else does it, so why shouldn't we? So I think it's massively important for every civil servant to operate with those values. And one of the things we're trying to push very hard is, and we're testing and measuring through the People Survey, is, you know, how easy is it to challenge within your department? And I think that's a massively important thing. And we are encouraging people to be empowered and engage and challenge if they think things are wrong, if we're getting the delivery of policies wrong, if there's something ethically people are worried about, then it's massively important. And we've opened up the route through the Civil Service Commissioners, and we've got these values built into legislation. So we've made huge steps forward in the last few years, but it is massively important that everyone takes their individual responsibilities seriously to escalate these things through the proper channels and not to sit quietly by.
Let's see if we can get the audience to contribute on this. Could you just imagine you're a question time audience, and you know how excited they sometimes get. I don't want you necessarily to get quite as excited as that, but the odd question from the floor. Is there one?
There's one there.
There's one there in the middle here on this left-hand side. Are we rushing a microphone? Yes, it's coming. It's coming. Thank you for asking the question and being patient. Here it comes.
Hi, my name's Aisha and I work in the Quango. In last year's People Survey, my organisation had 10% of people saying they'd been bullied, and I have not seen anything from the Cabinet Office who are trying to investigate this. In my own experience, for example, we've just gone and outsourced our IS services, IT, and I was one of the union reps that was part of the meetings that were taking place. And in my appraisal this year, my manager specifically said to me, because of my union activities and because I dare to challenge management, my performance from being excellent was just too good or fully effective. And they wrote complete rubbish in my appraisal, which I then felt I had to defend myself in that appraisal. Now, if I go and apply for a job within the Cabinet Office, which seeks line management approval or will read my comments, what's your reaction going to be, Gus, when you see it? Are you going to look at me and think, oh, here's a difficult, or what's your HR going to think? Here's a difficult person, throw away the application? What do you do with things like that?
Thank you very much. Let's just hold that. I will get Gus to answer that in a minute. I just want to see if there are any other questions in the... There's one on the front row here, running along to give you the microphone. It's not the front row, it just looks like the front row from me. It's the second row. Yes. Hello,
it's Carl from Job Centre Plus.
Yes.
It's not that easy to actually challenge at work because obviously you've touched on cultures and things people do, and it's just the way that it is. I do believe in the actual values, and I do try to make sure that I keep up to them. But obviously, you can't be responsible for other people's behaviour, but I don't believe that it is that easy to actually challenge, although there is, things in place for you to be able to do that. I do believe, touching on the other lady that just spoke, if you are a union rep or if your face does not fit, there is issues at work with you and you just have to kind of like cope with them. What do you say to that? I don't...
Shami, do you have anything you want to say on this?
Well, clearly, if anybody feels that they have been bullied or discriminated against on grounds of union membership or being a union representative, that is unlawful. And that should be taken up with management, that should be taken up with the union, and if necessary, people should take legal advice. And that's wherever you work. It is not acceptable to take the view that union membership or being a representative is a problem per se. But I think the bigger point is this, that no organisation of any kind will sustain if it cannot deal with differences of opinion and actually with professional differences within its own body. The difference between being a professional person and being a worker as such is the ability to make some ethical judgments and to honour a code which of the kind that you have as civil servants. And that's true with any profession, lawyers, doctors, so they cannot just be ordered to do things if the orders are contrary to the code. I have lawyers that work for me at Liberty, and if I ordered any one of them to do something that they thought was contrary to their professional code of conduct, they would say, Shami, I'm really sorry, but I will not do that. And they would be right. And I'm sure that ought to be the case and must be the case in the civil service as well, and that's why it's so important, I think, that we now have legislation that underpins the code and means that this isn't just talk. These are hard-edged values that can give you protection. Now, on the issue of whistleblowing as such, there is of course a difficult tension here, as there often is in professional life. There are dilemmas in professional life, and the tension goes like this. There are two democratic goods that are sometimes in tension with each other. One is that it's, of course, incredibly important that public servants, civil servants, maintain confidentiality to their political masters and to the public that they serve, and that confidentiality is incredibly important. On the other hand, when a professional discovers wrongdoing that really ought to be exposed and dealt with, there is a tension between the duty of confidentiality that all professional employees have on the one hand and this public interest in getting the problem dealt with. And ultimately the answer to that is, of course, that the service itself, the institution itself, as has been said so ably, should have mechanisms to allow that kind of debate and dissent internally. If those mechanisms break down, then in the end an individual is left to their conscience. But what you want is for that kind of breakdown to happen incredibly rarely, or ideally not at all. And that's kind of Gus's job, really, and the job of all of his senior colleagues to make those moments of conscience, those crises of conscience, as rare as can possibly be achieved. And even when those crises of conscience happen and people feel they need to make a public disclosure and or leave the service, I think even at that moment there should be some proportionality and some discretion about the response. Now, when one chooses to leave one's work out of conscience, that's a very serious thing to do, particularly in a recession. But I hope that generally, you won't then have to be prosecuted for it. But these are extreme scenarios we're talking about here. The better way forward, both for the individual professional civil servant and for the civil service and for the public services, is, as has been said, for there to be proper mechanisms to raise problems in the workplace. And if it's not happening at a local level, at a departmental level, there've got to be mechanisms to escalate that up, because that is the test of a profession, and one that I hope will survive for many years to come.
Thank you very much. I've got one question, more question from the floor, then I'll get Gus to answer that point, and then we're going to move on. But I do recommend the Civil Service Code. Sham is right to think of it as the Civil Service's professional code, and it's a really short but really important document, and it is underpinned by the law now. Parliament has now put it, effectively given the underpinning in the law. That's a very big step after 150 years of waiting for it to happen. Yes.
My name is Caroline. I work for Department for Transport. Something that David Rowland said before he retired really stuck with me, which was the most difficult thing that he had to do was say no. And I think that's quite important in our commercial dealings. As civil servants, we are required to act in a more commercial way. My question to the panel is, how do we support our teams and our staff and people who work with us to work commercially, but also be supported in that saying no when necessary?
Can we just hold that question, because there's a whole clutch of questions next on that subject, so I will come to that. Do you just want to answer?
Sure. On the question of bullying, let me be clear about this. We need in the civil service to have a zero tolerance regime on bullying. It's absolutely clear. It is unacceptable. Nevertheless, it is actually true from the People's Survey. We know that the numbers aren't zero everywhere. They're not zero, I'm afraid, in the Cabinet Office. And in response to that, we've been working on that. I'm leading a group on bullying and harassment to try and work out what are the issues that staff have got, what are the problems, how do we get around them, how do we solve them. In our Better Cabinet Office week, we got some actors in to portray some bullying activities and got people to respond to, how would they react to those sorts of things. So there's lots you can do. It's very important. I would say a Quango should not be sitting back saying, what's the Cabinet Office going to tell us to do about bullying? It should be saying itself, what are we doing? Because the management there need to take it as their responsibility. On your issue about your appraisal, I completely agree with Shami about the whole question of if someone said something to do with your trade union activities, that is absolutely should not happen. That's completely inappropriate and, as Shami said, actually illegal. So that definitely shouldn't happen. I think it's very important that when we do appraisals, the one thing I would say that the People's Survey tells us is that we're very bad at dealing with poor performance, and sometimes people shy away from those honest conversations. So it's really important that we, again, live by our values of honesty and objectivity in appraisals. And so I'd say that's absolutely crucial for it. And I think it was mentioned there that, well, sometimes that's the way it is about challenge. Well, it shouldn't be. And we all have a responsibility to speak up in those circumstances, and to create a culture in which people feel that it is acceptable to speak up. Shami referred to the case where in extremis someone needs to resign. There certainly was a Foreign Office lawyer over Iraq, and she eventually resigned. But that is, that's an enormous step for any of us, and we really want to make use of and have internal machinery that allows people all those opportunities to work these things through with their line managers or with their line manager's line manager, if it's the line manager that's the problem, or if you can't get there, going to the civil service commissioners. I think there are lots of avenues there. I'd really encourage people to use them. There are those tensions that Shami spoken about. We have some obligations to confidentiality in some of our work, but those obligations are, I'd say, subject to the code. Shami said, if I heard of a civil servant who said, well, I decided to do something that was against the code because I'd been told this on a piece of paper marked confidential, that's not an excuse. The code overrides any security markings whatsoever. We live by these values, we mean it in all cases.
I want to pick up this issue that our colleague from the Department of Transport raised about can you say no, and link it, Chris, with a question which has come from someone in NOMS in the Ministry of Justice, which is if there is evidence that policy developments are not really the most effective way of doing things, if there's evidence that actually ministers want to do something that's not sensible, or can civil servants really say no, or is that actually another way of damaging your career? The code, of course, is very clear about this. It says you need to speak up, there needs to be proper evidence-based policy. But the pressures on civil servants to do what the minister wants, rightly to some degree, are also very great. What about that dilemma?
Well, it is a serious dilemma. I mean, I think we have to distinguish, and we almost have distinguished very clearly, between the fundamental basic employment rights, which are common whether you're in the civil service, in public service, or in the private sector, bullying, harassment, trade union activity. These are all enshrined in employment rights. They are people's basic rights. And then the very unique aspects of being a civil servant, which is giving advice to ministers and influencing policy. And I've touched the civil service much more lightly than the other members of the panel. But in the 5 years I was a commissioner, and now I'm related to the civil service, but not so directly. I do detect from time to time a slight super deference to the political Kingdom, and that people are cautious about speaking up to ministers. But whenever I have been involved in having to speak up to ministers, and whenever I have been involved in correcting something which I think is a misunderstanding, it's actually been welcomed, and it has not jeopardized people's employment rights and employment opportunities. So you may have contrary evidence. I have not seen people's careers limited because they boldly, on the basis of evidence, provide information advice, including advice to ministers on the basis of evidence, and accurately present the options of facts. When that happens, I have not seen people's careers being limited by it.
Well, it is quite hard, speaking from experience, but Gus, is it hard? Can you do it? You have to do it, I guess.
You have to do it. I mean, we go through every day saying no to ministers on all sorts of things because the evidence points in different directions, or what they want to do is illegal, for example,
Not very often.
or daft. Not very often, we hope. Ultimately, we have the threat, those of us who are accounting officers, of saying that the only way we can do this is if you give me a direction, which, for example, if something is truly awful value for money, and the minister says, look, for political reasons I want to do this, then we have a formal process whereby we can ask for a direction. I think a famous case was when a Permanent Secretary called Tim Lancaster was at what was the predecessor of DFID, and his minister, Douglas Hurd, who was a good minister, I'd say, very good minister, said that over something called the Pergau Dam, that he wanted to go ahead with it, spend money on it, and Tim said it's really poor value for money, you shouldn't do it. Tim gave a direction. Tim said, well, I'm only going to do it if you give me a direction. These directions become public and are then discussed by Parliament. So that process happened. Actually, if you look back on it, I think last year there were a very large number of directions. Personally, I've always used the direction as a kind of nuclear threat. So I've said to the minister, look, the only way you could actually do that would be if you were to give me a direction. And I've always found that in those circumstances, ministers have backed off. So I would like to say that all ministers welcome honest advice always, and nearly all the time they do, but there are occasions when they find it difficult. But I think it's our job to be absolutely clear. It's not in any minister's long-run interest to have people around them who are yes men, or indeed yes women, and it's very much in their interest that we say no when that's appropriate.
I'm going to keep us moving because there's a lot of issues to cover, and this is a bunch of questions that go a bit like this. It's put like this: civil servants are expected rightly, loyally to support the government of the day, but this is one side of an implied bargain. The other is that our decent and by no means lavish benefits, this isn't my words, these are your words, our by no means lavish benefits are not attacked, and there's a reasonable amount of job security. Does the panel agree that this bargain is in danger of being broken? That's one question. Another one was, civil servants are supposed to be loyal to the party in power, but often civil servants seem to be used as a political punch bag. There are too many of us, we don't work hard enough, and our pensions are too good. Does the panel agree that politicians also owe some loyalty to civil servants? How do we change that culture? Well, those are your questions. You get the issue. This is about the bargain, the implied bargain that underpins why a lot of people here joined the civil service. Neil, do you want to come in? It's a difficult one, I know.
Yes, thank you. Well, can we just take job security and conditions of service, first of all? I don't think anyone can claim absolute job security. That's the reality of life. That's the way it is. It has tended to be so in the past, but much more so demanding looking ahead. Everything changes. But conditions of service are for me, a different matter. And one of the things that vexes me greatly is that the debate which tends to run is that civil servants, local government employees, others in the public sector have somehow got conditions of service which are far above any reasonable level of expectation, quite wrong, and it's time they were all pulled back. Now, of course, if you look at society and a civilised society, What you want to see is everyone having good conditions, everyone having pensions which mean that they can sustain themselves when they retire. And to actually try to turn the clock back like that, I think is very difficult. There are pressures, there have to be adjustments, I would recognise that. Insofar as using public servants as a punch bag, personally I think that's highly irresponsible, frankly. I think it's very difficult to expect loyalty. To expect loyalty and respect from those who are carrying out your policies means that they have the right to expect the same from you, loyalty and respect. Of course, there will be differences of views. And I've always taken the view that that's a matter between, in my own background, between the council leader and chairman and the chief executive, Gus in this case, as something to discuss, but not to actually carry out in local government, in public, where all you do is actually undermine the standing, not just of those who work in public service, but of the politicians themselves. It serves no purpose. We should all have a right to be proud of what we do in public service. Yes, to be challenged. Yes, at times to be told things can be done better. But there has to be, within all of that, some sort of mutual respect on which you can build the way in which services are delivered. Thank you.
Well, I agree with every word of that, which makes it different from the TV question time when we would be really going at it hammer and tongs by now. But Melanie Phillips wasn't invited, and so we're just going to have to do the. But I agree with all of that. On the sort of terms and conditions, I have no doubt that people for many years joined the public service because of their public service ethic, but also thought that there was a bit of a bargain. They would take a smaller salary and a prospect of a smaller salary in the future in return for doing work that they loved. Of course, they're public spirited people, but also because they thought that there would be certain particular benefits like pensions in particular. And I do think that if you're going to try and alter that for existing members of staff in particular, you have to do that by negotiation. But on the point about loyalty and I do think there is a bit of a contract here. We talked before, and all of these questions are interrelated. We talked about duties of confidentiality before and how they have to be balanced with being able to raise, very, very serious problems. I think that governments of all stripes have been pretty well served by the civil service in my lifetime, as I can recall, and I think the public have too. I personally, even though, as David said, it's sometimes my job to be oppositional to various government departments because of the political decisions that ministers make, that's fine. But I actually think that independent public servants are a constitutional protection in this country. And I think there's a danger in thinking that the only people with legitimacy are those who are elected, and people who are independent public servants are somehow not to be accorded the same respect. And that's very, very dangerous in a democratic constitution. And it's particularly dangerous, I think, if you want to keep loyalty going and you want to command the respect and loyalty of your servants, of your confidential advisors, of the people who go out and do the difficult work of implementing your high-level political decisions. It's very, very difficult to command loyalty and the best that people can offer if you're slagging them off at the same time. So it's not just wrong, it's counterproductive, and I wish that politicians would stop doing it.
Chris, do you want to add a bit of...
I do want to say, I think that the pay and benefits debate has really got clouded in a lot of disinformation, to be honest. I think that there is a difference between pay and benefits of the civil service at the very top from at the very bottom, and it's worth distinguishing people's circumstances at the top and the bottom. I think the issue about pensions, my view about it, I was lucky enough to be a member of the Senior Salaries Review Board for a couple of years and was involved in determining what Gus's remuneration ought to be. And And I happen to think that the pay at the very top of the civil service is about right. And it's a judgment. You have to try and work out all sorts of conflicting factors to work out what it should be. But if you take the pay and the benefits, including the pension, it seems to us on the SSRB that the money was about right. But I think the problem that arises is valuing the pension. The pension isn't just what it costs the government to provide the pension. The pension is what it would cost you or me if we walked out of the civil service and went off and bought that pension for ourselves. And it's actually a very, very large percentage of our base salary. And I think because pension accounting and pension calculating is so complicated, it is genuinely arithmetically complicated, I think that it is that many people in the civil service, if I may say something mildly unpopular, many people underestimate what the real value of that pension benefit is. So I am hoping that at least out of this debate there will come a proper valuation so that people know I'm paid 100 and in addition to that 100 I get this value in pension benefit, and I don't think people properly value that. Now if they did properly value it, then they could make the sort of commitment that I think they ought to make to stay within the civil service or to join the civil service. And the ultimate game, I think, is that you should work with people in the civil service for whom pay and benefits is seldom a discussed issue, because broadly speaking it's okay, and broadly speaking you feel comfortable about it. Now my fear at the moment is we've moved into a period of considerable discomfort and uncertainty. But I think there is disinformation around the pensions issue.
I should give Gus the last word on this one, and then I'm going to fit in a very quick final question. So, Gus.
On the question about loyalty and respect, I strongly agree with what Neil and Shami said, that it's massively important that goes two ways. And I get very disappointed when you get public comments that move away from that. On the whole question of job security and pensions. Job security, we can never guarantee perfect job security. I think everybody knows that. On pensions, as you said, there is I spend my life trying to get people to care more about pensions. The whole of the British public don't save enough for their pensions. They're going to live a lot longer than they realise, and they're not saving enough, and that's a massive public policy issue. It's also weird in the civil service that actually we weight the amount of money we give you mostly to after you've retired. This is a strange performance pay system, so that mostly what you get is after you've left us. It's odd, and you don't value it as much as you should, as was quite rightly put, because you probably find it quite difficult to calculate, quite rightly. We are in a situation where there is a very, very big deficit. The government is suggesting some proposals. These are being discussed with the trade unions at the moment. They will ensure that all of the accrued rights you've got are maintained, and it will be a defined benefit system rather than a defined contribution system. And as we know, in the private sector, it's very rare to get that. It will be an index system, indexed to inflation, albeit through the CPI, not the RPI. And it being the CPI rather than the RPI will unambiguously reduce the value of your future pensions. And there will be an increase in pensions contributions, which will be more for the likes of me. I'm glad to hear you think I'm paid about the right amount. I wonder what you think of the BBC Director General's pay. He's gets about 4 times what I get. Is that about right?
No, I think it's excessive, if you want my view. And I think there is a huge problem of excessive pay outside the civil service, but there isn't a problem within the civil service. And if I'm allowed to make a political point, I think that the Prime Minister made a mistake in setting his own salary as a sort of benchmark. And I think it's a mistake that needs to be rectified.
We're almost out of time. Inevitably, these things are very brief. We've had an hour at it. I've got one final question. I'm going to read you a quote, I think, from Francis Maude's speech yesterday, when he said, "The good, objectivity, honesty, integrity, impartiality, we must keep. The bad, sluggishness, rigidity, insularity, must go." So panel, you've got about 30 seconds each. If you could do one thing to make the civil service better, what would it be? Go on, Chris.
Well, I think people should. The one thing would be more effective performance management processes. I think we need a high-performing, well-paid civil service, and I think better performance management processes would aid that.
Performance management. Neil?
Well, I'd be in favour of really meaningful appraisal where people actually sat down and talked to management about their progress and had the opportunity to develop and to understand the way in which they could carry it forward. Tremendous potential in the civil service, and it should be actually realised.
Shami?
I spent about 6 years as a civil servant. It was an incredibly formative time in my career, perhaps the most formative time in my career. And as with any kind of profession, some people are better at it than others. No doubt there's occasional sluggishness and insularity, but I have to say that is not a description that I generally recognise, either from having been on the inside or subsequently on the outside. Rigidity can be, by the way, a very good thing when the rigidity is being firm in your integrity, your impartiality, and so on. So if I was going to say one thing to you in closing, I would say louder and prouder in defence of your values.
Louder and prouder in defence of the values. Gus?
One simple thing to make the civil service better, increase our diversity, and the practical idea is get Shami to get out of the job she's in at the minute, wasting her time, and come and work for us in the civil service. Actually, you're not wasting your time in your current job, so I take that back.
But
you could do even more now.
But she'd have to be recruited through fair and open competition and on merit, which I'm sure she would be. But
I think she should become a judge.
Chris wants to appoint her as a judge. Shami, any last word?
I nearly went into the Doctor Who experience next door instead of coming in here. And as it suddenly turns into career guidance for Shami, it kind of feels as if I should have gone into the Doctor Who experience.
It's right on 4 o'clock and we should draw to a close. Can I, on your behalf, thank the panel for giving up their time and for dealing with your composite questions very frankly and directly. Can I thank you for being here and for participating?